Welcome to today's lecture, guys, on one of the most transformative inventions in European history, the printing press. This invention is going to change the way ideas, arguments, and information could spread quickly and reach large audiences. Think of it as the social media of the Renaissance. Just like TikTok, Instagram, or X can make a message go viral today, the printing press allowed pamphlets, books, and new ideas to circulate across Europe faster than ever before. In this lecture, we're going to explore how the printing press worked, why it spread so rapidly, and how it shaped the early modern world, much like social media shapes ours today. So let's start at the beginning. The invention of the printing press happens in 1440 by a man named Johannes Gutenberg. And this invention is considered to be one of the most transformative developments of the early modern period of European history. In a quote that's often attributed to Gutenberg himself, he says, "Give me 26 soldiers of lead and I will conquer the world." And obviously here he's referring to the letter blocks that would create the media that people would consume during this time period. So to give some historical context, before the printing press was invented, manuscripts were copied by hand. Monks, scribes in monasteries, they wrote these texts out meticulously by hand, letter by letter, word by word, page by page. Books, therefore, were expensive and rare because they took so much effort to create, and so only the wealthy and the upper class could even own books, which left many people in Europe highly illiterate. So literacy was very limited. Now, if we look at the growing demand and kind of after the growth of universities, trade, and urbanization, this kind of fueled, the spread of information once the printing press came to be. Vernacular languages were gaining traction. So, the languages of England, like English or French in France and the German states, texts were more and more being created in these languages other than just the Latin of the Bible. And there just became an increased need for books as literacy increased and people were gaining more wealth. Books became cheaper and they became more accessible to everyday people. So looking at the inventor himself, Johannes Gutenberg, an image depicting him here, who he was a German inventor from Mainz. He created movable metal type printing press circa 1440. Now this was not necessarily a new idea, at least in some parts of the world. The Chinese had been playing around with this technology for quite some time, although this is the first time we start to see the Roman alphabet used in a printing press machine. So the key invention was the movable type, which allowed you to move the letters to create the different words and things that would then be printed on pages. Oil-based ink, which led to these documents lasting longer and being easier to manufacture, and adjustable press mechanism. Now, notable work, the Gutenberg Bible. This is considered to be the first Bible printed with a printing press. This occurred in 1455. So this is the first major book printed with movable type in the West. And this is an example of a Gutenberg Bible. This is actually on display at the New York Public Library. It was purchased by a man by the name of James Lennox in 1847. And it was the first Gutenberg Bible to actually be acquired by a United States citizen. So something very fascinating to go see if you're ever in New York City. Now, its impact on European society. It led to the spread of knowledge. Books became cheaper and more accessible to people. There was an explosion of printed material, again, pamphlets, almanacs, newspapers. So again, just like social media of the day, this is how people started to get more and more news. We see a rise in literacy because of the printing press. More people learned to read, especially in urban areas. And then you had the standardization of text. So uniform text for scholars, lawyers, and theologians. So there was a common language developing because of the printing press. Now on this chart, you can kind of see the impact of the rise in literacy. So it starts at 1550, and you can see all these different countries: Poland, Belgium, Ireland, Russia, Spain, Italy, Germany, France, Great Britain, Sweden, the Netherlands. And you can see in essentially almost all of these that the literacy rate rises pretty consistently from 1550 to 1900. Now, there were political and religious consequences, which we're going to get into more of these in our next unit on the Reformation. But you had the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, who's pictured here, he used a printing press to spread his 95 Theses in 1517. Again, we're going to talk a lot more about that later on. Pamphlets and vernacular Bibles fueled reform and dissent. So it was more information out there. This led to, new ideas catching on quicker. This challenged authority. It undermined the monopoly of the Catholic Church on knowledge. So people no longer had to rely on their priest in the church to basically tell them what was what. They could figure it out on their own. And it empowered lay people to kind of interpret the scriptures. They could come to their own conclusions because now they could, receive printed Bibles and learn, to read and interpret those on their own. And this ultimately leads to censorship. So governments and the church tried to control the content that was being printed. And like I said, as we're going to see later on when we get deeper into the Reformation period, this is going to be quite the challenge, and something that's not really going to be possible. Once the cat is out of the bag, it's not going back in. So scientific and intellectual revolution. So we see the scientific revolution. Scientists like Copernicus and Galileo, they spread their scientific findings more widely, which include, the Earth not being the center of the universe. So getting rid of the geocentric theory and, putting out the idea that the sun is the center and the planets revolve around that. Very controversial stuff for the time. Leads to the Enlightenment. So philosophers and political theorists, they circulate ideas about reason, liberty, and rights. And then you see the Republic of Letters. This was basically a long-distance intellectual community in the late 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. And all of this we're going to get, again, we're just barely touching the surface right now. We're going to get more in depth with this as we get to Unit 3 and 4 of this school year. So Republic of Letters also fostered communication among intellectuals across Europe as well. So it created this kind of intellectual community that kind of built off each other's research, much like we have today with journal databases where people can read research from people all over the world, not just within our own area. Continuing this trend, new industries popped up: printers, booksellers, and paper makers. These became fields that people were making money in. We see a rise in the middle class, not to the extent that we have today, but very extensive for this time period. So this happened because of the access to knowledge, which contributed to kind of a social mobility and urban culture. So again, this is mostly happening in urban settings. You're not really seeing the same rise in the middle class in rural areas. And then commercial publishing. So printed books became a commodity to a wider audience. So to kind of summarize all this, Gutenberg's press, this equals transformative technology. Major changes come because of it. It accelerates the Renaissance, the Reformation, scientific revolution, Enlightenment, 4 time periods that are a major component of this course. Shaped early modern European thought, politics, and society, which is going to eventually shape what we think of as modern Europe today. And it leads to a lasting legacy in global communication. Okay, we still depend on printing presses for all of our printed media today. So this is technology that, even though it is, 600 plus years old, still shapes in some ways the way that we communicate today. All right, so that's it for today. As always, if you have questions, just drop me a comment or shoot me an email.